Welcome in, Hawks fans. Your boy Bryce Lewis back at it again for another Bleav in Hawks episode. We have a special guest on today to talk some Hawks with me, talk about everything that's going on in the world of the Hawks. Brad Rowland, the man who people would say maybe he's the face of Hawks media.
Oh, Lord.
His podcast somewhere at Locked On Sports. You should definitely go check that out and everything like that. He's all over the spectrum. He does a lot of different things. So very well-versed guy and someone I've had on a couple of times. And we also went to the same college. No, not at the same time, but we went to the same college too. So there's a fun fact. So how are you doing today, Brad?
I'm good. I'm much older. That's probably not a great thing, but no, I appreciate you having me on. Sorry for that involuntary reaction to your very nice comments. Thank you for that.
No,
but yeah, always happy to be here, man.
Yeah, man. Appreciate you definitely, man. And listen, there's a lot going on, especially after last night. You know, I think everybody within the Hawks fan base is looking at this season as like, okay, seems like a failure. Now there's major questions coming into the offseason, right? So I'm going to pick your brain a little bit about this. And so my first question, though, for you is you've been covering the team, you said, for what, 13 years now?
Yeah, just 14? Finished season 13. That means I'm old, basically. But yeah, that's right.
Yes, you've covered a lot of Hawks basketball. You've seen a lot. For this season, where would this rank for you, I guess, in terms of just eventful seasons that you've covered with this team? Especially, it feels like the last 4 years have been eventful. But this season particularly, with how it started, how it went, and how it ended.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, like, there's been a lot of talk about, like, frustrating seasons almost, not necessarily eventful, but, like, on that level, it was pretty high. I mean, it wasn't I think they obviously underperformed expectations pretty severely this year. It wasn't like they had so many crazy events. Like, I feel like in previous years, even though they were a little bit better, they had more drama almost. Like, there was some of the Trae stuff and the Nate stuff, and you're firing coaches, and there's no fired coaches this year. There's not really any internal drama. I mean, you could argue, some of the trade stuff, of course, that was out there in January, February around Dejounte in particular, but like, it wasn't like it was a super every day is a drama situation. They just underperformed, and it was frustrating to watch. It was frustrating to cover. The team wasn't, not that they were in bad spirits, but like, when you're losing and you're not playing the way you want to play, nobody's super happy. So it was frustrating through that. I mean, I think they've obviously been worse on the court. Like during the rebuild, they had some really rough years, but during rebuild, there's not pressure. You know what I mean? It's like you're kind of in this situation where everyone kind of knows, secretly deep down knows the deal. When your best players are Dennis Schroeder and Taurean Prince, you're not going to win a lot, and everybody kind of knows it. But now they had expectations, and that they kind of ran it back from last year. I'm sure we can get into that, but it's high on the frustrating scale for sure since I've been covering the team, just because of where they were quote unquote supposed to be, where they hoped they would be, and where they actually ended up.
Yeah, for sure. And I think and I think that's been the biggest thing is that with the expectations. I mean, I remember Dejounte before the season media day saying they expect to be a top 6 seed. They expect to be there. They want to be in the play-in and to be in the play-in again, and then lose the way you lost the play-in. It just feels like, whoa. That was not what we expected here. I want to break this up because I've mentioned this a few times, and I want to get your thoughts. I have said that I have felt like the front office hasn't been the clearest about what the plan is for this team. I feel like they've said things that you can kind of like maybe piece together, but they haven't flat out said, this is what we want for the team. This is what we expect. I think at the beginning of the season, everybody expected them to be competitive. And then it felt like, especially after the trade deadline, I would say, it felt like there was a bit of a pivot. Landry Fields in that presser was like, oh, well, we're focused on our long-term goals and not our short-term goals, and we don't want to make any rash decisions. And then Steve Koonin comes on, on a radio show and is like, well, we wanted to do things the right way. And it's like, so what does that mean? Are we developing? Are we like, is this just a development year? Like, what? Because it feels like that's different from what it was at the beginning of the year. So do you also maybe look at it the same way where it's like, yeah, the front office hasn't necessarily been clear about the vision for this team. And that maybe is one of the reasons why there is so much maybe unrest within the Hawks fan base. Because it's like, well, we're under this impression we're supposed to be better than expected. And you guys are talking like, well, we're focused on future stuff, not right now.
I think you're right. I think it is very fair what you said. I think that the messaging, it's not unexpected, but like coming into the year, they weren't saying they were going to win the East. They want to win the East, of course, but like they were comfortably saying, as you said, Dejounte, and the messaging was, we don't want to be in the play-in again. At the very least, they didn't want to be in the play-in. And starting there, I think that, not getting there is that you're going to change your tone on some level. But I think it's it gets kind of confusing, like you said, when there is that kind of soft pivot. And I think I'm glad you mentioned the Landry Fields press conference, because as soon as you started the question, I thought about that first. And it was awkward. It was 30 minutes, and it almost felt like Landry was not prepared to say to like go in one direction. And for me, it was surprising, because they had to know it was controversial that they didn't do anything. You know what I mean? Given where they were at that point in time, they weren't out of it. Like, they were obviously in position to at least be a play-in team. Like, the season wasn't over. But for that team with this expectations to kind of go into the deadline, have all that noise, and not do a single thing, I didn't go crazy on them for not doing anything, but I thought it was interesting and kind of surprising. And then to not have really a real answer for why they didn't do anything, other than it didn't come to them in the way they wanted to. Yeah, I can see why fans are frustrated. I mean, it's frustrating to cover, much less be a fan of. Like, you're hearing, it feels like spin is the way that I would say. Like, it feels like they're kind of just trying to spin right now. And maybe that's just the way that, Steve Koonin is the CEO. Like, he's a marketing guy. Like, that's part of the deal with him. I like Steve. I almost don't care what Steve says about basketball. And I don't say that in a bad way. It's just like, that's not his job. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But with Landry, I think he just has a tendency to speak in this, like, in plaudits, and he kind of just talks in a circle sometimes. And I think that's it's on one hand, you could get away with saying a lot of words and not saying anything, which might be the goal on some level. Like, you don't want to give anything away. But when you're not winning, that can be frustrating. And there were a couple things. You remember? I'm not sure you remember this, but like he gave I think it was on the radio or somewhere. He said something about how they kind of acknowledged, like, the Trae Dejounte hadn't worked on some level.
Yeah,
he gave that was pretty candid on that. It was like, basically, like, if you look at the numbers, it's not when we kind of what they thought it was going to be, kind of thing. And that's revelatory. Like, that actually tells you a little bit more what they're thinking. But I think in general, they just have they don't like to give you a lot of information. And Quin's that way too. I mean, on one hand, the head coach is the guy that we get to talk to every day. So, like, he gets to take all the questions that I try to ask Quin like roster questions, because he's not in charge of the roster, but he's also the only guy you can ask. You know what I mean? A lot of the time it's like he's up there, and Quin's not someone who's going to reveal a lot, and he kind of laughs it off. And but it's like, he's not going to tell you a lot of stuff, and some coaches tell you more than others. He's really I don't like to tell you a lot of stuff about strategy and all that stuff too. So, long-winded answer, my apologies, but I think that it's definitely understandable that it's frustrating, and because they just ran it back from last year, so it was even harder to kind of see what they wanted to do, because they haven't made transactions. Like, often you learn about teams and what they actually want, what they think, by what they actually do, and they didn't do anything. They haven't really done anything. They've made one major transaction in the last 2 years since the Dejounte trade, which was 2 years ago. They've made one transaction that was major, in my opinion. That's the John Collins trade, and we all know why that happened. It was just to save money. That's all it was. And to generously, you could say, to clear some space for Jalen, but Jalen would have played anyway. Like, they had plenty of room for that. As we saw at the end of the year, they were not exactly overflowing with depth. So that move was just basically to save money. So even then, what did you learn other than they didn't want to pay electric tax? That's all you've learned. So I can't wait to find out what they actually think, just by what they actually do. But as far as what they're saying, it is really, really unclear. And it puts people like us in a bad spot too, because we're having to, I have some sources, like, I can call people, but it's a lot easier to be like, hey, he said this, they did this, versus like reading between the lines, like you said. So that kind of adds, I would say, to the frustration.
Yeah, for sure. And like you mentioned, usually when you acquire new coaches, like Quin and everything, you try to get, like you say, a roster that adapts to what he wants to do. And with the lack of transactions, it's like, we really did that?
No.
And so then it's like, and that's why, and we'll get into this more, but like, people are like iffy on Quin right now. And I'm like, I mean, he's just working what they've had, and technically they gave him less depth, with that. Even though I can also say some players improved. I could say, well, multiple players improved, but we were worse. Like, what is that? Is that a him thing? Is that just teams just don't work because they've been together too long, et cetera, et cetera? But you mentioned Dejounte and Trae, and so obviously the big elephant in the room is that the backcourt. What is the future? You know, you mentioned Landry, Mike Bray also mentioned on a podcast that we got to see about that. That's one thing they've been transparent about. We need to see about Dejounte Murray and Trae Young. And with the way the season ended, with Murray able to carry this team to about like a 500 record when Trae was out, you saw some really good performances, but you also saw some bad performances because I always had to remind people they still have injuries too. You know, it's not like you're going to get this consistent team on a daily basis of injuries. You know, it's just good that they're able to still play up. But then it's like, well, is Trae Young holding them back? And I'm like, well, they both have showed when they're by themselves, they're pretty much what you would expect from both of them. Dejounte closer to what you probably thought he was going to be coming from San Antonio, and Trae Young is Trae Young. So it may just be more of a they don't work together thing. So I just want to get your thoughts on that. Do you sense that the breakup is coming? Like this is it for them? Do you think that there's a chance they may let's just tweak the roster one more time around these two and see? I know Lou Will came out today and said he would like to see that. Just what is your feelings covering this team? You know, seeing Dejounte, seeing Trae, seeing them on the floor. Just what are you feeling from that?
Yeah, I almost forgot about Mike Bray. That was an interesting comment, and it's also that got a lot because Mike Bray is kind of famous as a former college head coach. Mm-hmm. That got more attention than it probably should have. Like, because he's like their sixth assistant. Like, he's not like a guy who's going to make decisions. Anyway, no, I think that the way I would put it is, if you asked me to say yes or no to whether they are broken up in some form, meaning that one of them is traded, I would say it is more likely than not that it happens. So I would say yes to that. That's what the league thinks too. That's a consensus around the league. What I will not say, and what people have kind of gotten to the point where it's like, oh, they're definitely going to trade. No, I hesitate on the word definitely most of the time. Like, there are very few things that I am that confident about. Like, in fact, the only thing in recent memory I would say is that I was 100% sure that they were going to not pay the tax the last couple of years, and I was right about that. But that's not personnel based. But I would just say that, yeah, I think that they're probably going to do something with one of them. Now, this is the first time I would say that I actually think they could maybe trade Trae Young. I think it's not going to happen, but I think that it's at least plausible to me for the first time. It has not been plausible to me at any point, even when it's kind of been rumbling, Kevin O'Connor, all the stuff in the past. I've always, like, you make phone calls and it's like, no, that's not going to happen. This time, I don't know yet. I mean, great, the season just ended. I don't know where they're going to be. But obviously they are willing to trade Dejounte. That's been out there. They got pretty close a couple of times actually in January and February. Like, there was a day, and I said this on my show, so it's not like a secret, but there was a day where I got a call that was like, be ready to do an emergency podcast kind of thing from someone who would know. And they got real close, and it didn't happen. And that happens in the NBA sometimes. But they were, and Dejounte, to your point, and it's a good thing to remember, he did play very well, but that doesn't solve your problem. Dejounte playing well as the number one guy where he's most comfortable. And I've always maintained that. Like, Dejounte is most comfortable on the court when he is the guy and he's playing point guard. That isn't going to happen unless Trae is not there. You know what I mean? So it's that doesn't always solve your problem. He played well. That definitely happened. So do I think that Lou Will's point, like, they could try it one more time? I do think that it would be absolutely crazy. And I would be pretty shocked if they simply just actually ran it back again. Like, truly, like, ran it back. I think if you keep Trae Dejounte, you got to make a more significant change somewhere else on your roster. And Jalen's not going anywhere. Jalen's the safest guy on the whole roster, I would say, at this point. I would actually be more surprised if they traded Jalen Johnson this summer than Trae Young, which is actually, that's a new thing. This is the first time that I could ever say that someone would surprise me more if they got traded than Trae. But Jalen is like the safest guy to be here next year on the whole team. But I mean, I'm not saying this is not me reporting, but I'm just thinking out loud. Like, if they were to say, okay, we want to do this one more time with Trae and Dejounte, maybe it's you move on from Hunter, maybe it's you move on from Capela, or both, or you move on from Bogey. Like, something more major has to happen for them to look themselves in the eye and be like, okay, we're actually going to do this one more time. Because the numbers are what they are, the results are what they are. This team, as it is right now, including those two guys and the supporting cast, doesn't work on the level that they want it to work. It just doesn't. We've now seen that. And yeah, injuries happened this year. They had the 7th most missed games in the year. But look, before the huge rash of injuries, when they lost Trae and they lost Jalen, they still weren't very good. Like when they were pretty healthy, they still weren't very good. Like, so I guess the long story short is like, I think that they're probably going to trade one of them. I think Dejounte is more likely to be traded here in mid-April, but that could change. But there's too much buzz internally around the league. Everyone seems to think that they're going to break it up. And part of that's just logic, I think. Like even on the broadcast, I'm sure you listen to the ESPN. It's like they were doing a podcast during the game with Richard Jefferson. Just kept going back to it over and over and over again. And I get it; it's a talking point, but it's also because it seems to be kind of true. I think they're probably going to break them up, and we'll see.
Yeah, for sure. And I think obviously, like I said, you're on Hawks Twitter. People are fighting about that every day about who they're going to trade and who's going to be moved and things of that nature. And I've made an argument that if they are truly committed to development, which is one thing I feel like they have been consistent with, they want development. They've been wanting guys to get better. Guys like Kobe Buffkin, he probably would never be able to take that next step unless he gets into a bigger role, which means removing one of them, because Quin's just going to be like, well, Dejounte is my de facto backup point. So there's not really minutes for you. And they trust, Bogey's just that guy. I feel like coaches just trust and they're just going to play him, And so, for guys like him, they kind of need that move to happen if that's where they go. Because I've said that next year, especially with Wrestler and, him not spending and not wanting to pay tax, they could go. It's weird to say because Trae said they're a young team, but they could be even younger next year, so to say. I mean, you have Kobe, who you would think would take a bigger role. Muhammad Gay, I think people think would take a bigger role. Vic Krejci, he's still pretty young. Assuming that they'll keep him in restricted free agency, he'll take a bigger role. And so, really, outside of that, I mean, you just got to maybe figure out the center position, and then. I mean, Bay's not going to maybe play next year, if anything. I mean, depending if they keep him. I mean, I assume that would turn into like a 1-year rehab. We'll see where we are type situation. So it's if you go in that direction, what message does that send? Is because like you could be Oklahoma City and be young and win games, but I mean that's a very rare situation. So
yeah.
it's
hard. It's hard to do that, and also, and I know you know this, but like. There's this whole notion out there today, and not necessarily today, but for a while from certain Hawks people, it's like, well, why don't you just rebuild again? And the simple version is that I don't think ownership has any interest in that. They had to be dragged kicking and screaming to rebuild the first time. They didn't want to. They finally did it out of necessity. But also you traded your draft picks, and one of the big reasons you want to rebuild and kind of bottom out. And even if I don't love the word tank, but if you want to use the word tank, whatever, is to boost your own draft pick, and they don't have their own picks. So it's like, yeah, there's the one scenario that everyone keeps talking about, like just trade Trae for this picks back. It's like, well, number one, no one's ever reported that's actually a thing. It's just a fun thing to talk about. It's not like it's actually a thing you could just call and be like, by the way, I would like all my picks back. Like they might not give them to you. You know what I mean? And so there's lots of reasons why they don't want to do that. I think there is a logical potential pivot to a younger situation. Yeah, like highlighting Kobe. AJ had a lost year. I don't know if he's like not going to be long for Atlanta, but like keep it. I am not pouring dirt on AJ. I'll just say that out loud. But Kobe especially, and I think Moge flashes are there. Kongwu, you would think would be in a more prominent role next year if he is back to 100%, which he should be by then. But even then, I think that you're still from on high, and there's a whole conversation we can have about like ownership and wanting one thing and not wanting to pay enough to make that thing happen. But Tony doesn't want to lose as much as frustrating as it is to have an owner that kind of wants you to win now, but also won't pay. The win now part isn't going to stop, I don't think, from what I understand. Like I'd be pretty surprised if he was just signing off on a step back. You know what I mean? I think whatever they do next, whether it's even, by the way, even if it's a trade of Trae, which I don't think will happen again, but even if they do that, I think they're going to do that and try to win. Which those things don't really parallel for me, but hey, that's what they're. I think if they did that, they would kind of try to push in and be as good as they can be with Dejounte and whoever's left. You know what I mean? So maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe I will hear something different in the next couple weeks or months. But I think they, even if they get younger at certain spots, because it's a good point that you make. Like having Kobe in the role he was in this year, is not a good idea. It's just not logical. Like, you want to have that guy play more often. Part of that was injuries for this year, but the stagger of Trae and Dejounte, yeah, it makes perfect sense. But if you draft a guard in the first round who showed flashes this year, he can't really take a step forward with Trae and Dejounte both on the team. But I mean, that's not the reason to make a move, but it's certainly part of the calculus for sure.
Yeah, for sure. And then also, too, one of the biggest issues is they don't have a point of attack defender. And Kobe showed he can do that. And so you clearly have like you wouldn't have made that draft pick if you didn't know you had that weakness. And then it's weird to not play a person that you want to solve that weakness there. So that's why I feel like it's like, if they really are committed to that, you kind of have to do it just based off that alone. And so I guess my next question is, and this is a funny question because I know you've been getting into it with people about him, Clint Capela. You know, a guy who is a very mixed reaction to Clint Capela.
For sure.
I've been mad at Clint Capela before. I've said I've been hard on him at times, but I've also sat here and said, listen, he does things that really no one else can maybe do on this team. His rebounding when he's on, and he's, he can rebound with the best of them. He's still a guy who can maybe protect your rim, things of that nature. It just depends on where he is physically. But like you said, Okongwu, at some point, I just feel like at some point you got to let him just have it and say, let's see if he can be the guy for that position for us. You can't just keep playing this game of, we can determine that from him playing off the bench. So I guess my question is, what is Clint Capela's future with the team? Because I think obviously like a lot of people are ready to move on from him, but and we have some good results from Jalen Okongwu as well, and then in the sample size that we've seen. So it's not like that's a bad sample size and like, oh, that's been a step back. But I think people are just ready to take that step on, move off Clint, especially since they're trying to cut salary, and then figure out potentially who could be behind him and et cetera. So what is your opinion on Clint's future in Atlanta?
Yeah, the irony is, I'm rightly viewed, I think, as being higher on Clint than most people. But even I've said it on my show consistently, I remain shocked that Clint's on the team. Shocked. If you told me that they were 3 years ago, 2 years ago, even a year ago, they were still going to have Clint Onyeka, I would have fallen on the floor. I haven't understood their process with Clint, even as someone who thinks Clint is still a rock solid starting center. He's not the same guy he was 3 years ago. Sure. He's still a good player. I think at the end of the year, you saw he was driving a lot of their success. Like when he left the court, they were really bad. And when he was on the court, they were really good at the end of the year. That doesn't mean you keep him long-term. I'm not saying that. It's just, and it's almost two different discussions with Clint. It's like, no, he's not terrible, everybody, because he misses a layup every once in a while. But yes, I do understand that you need to have a different plan. And I do think that if I had to guess, they're probably going to move on from Clint this year, this summer. If only because it'll be easier to do so now. He's an expiring contract. There's just more options when you have a guy like that to spin off with 1 year left on his deal. Mm-hmm. Are you going to get a lot back in a trade? No, you're probably not going to get a lot back in a trade. That ship probably sailed 2 years ago. You should, if they were trying to sell high, they didn't do that. Okongwu, I like a lot. At the same time, I think it's fair to say that due to the combination of injuries at bad, unfortunate times, because this year he was having his best stretch in a long time right before he got hurt, and that's frustrating. But the combination of injuries and he's not, I think he's played well, but he hasn't forced their hand so much that they were like, okay, we have to do it now. I think that's what I've kind of heard basically around. So it's interesting because I don't know still that this front office and this coaching staff is 100% sold on Onyeka as the guy at center. They didn't draft him. This is a different regime, different coach, different GM. Yes, they paid him an extension, but that extension is a bargain contract. That's a deal where he doesn't have to play 30 minutes a game. He's being paid like he's the seventh man right now on that extension. It's a very cheap, and it's a good deal to have. Kudos to the Hawks for having that deal signed. It's a very good contract. I still think if they move on from Clint, they're probably going to go out and invest something else at center, whether it's a draft pick or a better than normal backup center, who's also happens to be probably not necessarily a 7-footer, but a bigger guy. Because we all know Onyeka is small. It is what it is. They're probably going to want to have somebody that is a change up size wise alongside him. Whether it's Donovan Clingan's been a popular topic on Hawks Twitter as a rookie potentially. Khalil Ware has been a big topic. All these guys in the draft, there are some of those guys in the draft that would make some sense on some level, but at the same time, you're still you're going another first round pick at center when you already spent one on Nika, a high one. So no, that's a sneaky one. I think obviously Trae and Dejounte are going to get all the headlines, and I get that. I've still remained fascinated by the center spot, and I think it's probably going to finally be the end of the Capela era, if I had to guess. But I'm not 100% sure about that because they just haven't done it yet. I mean, they're just kicking it down the road, and it's like, okay, now or never. Because the sneaky thing also is that because he's expiring, you don't want to just lose that salary slot. Like if he stays the rest of the year and expires, like that, it can kind of hamper your team building because that money just kind of goes in the ether because you're already over the cap, and that's a nerd conversation, but it is true too. So I love to know. I would be interested in, for sure, giving Onyeka more of a full-fledged chance at being the guy, but we just haven't seen it yet. And I wish he had been able to play late in the year and maybe proven it even more and maybe turn the corner a little bit more. But it seems like every time he gets like right on the edge of that, something happens. Either he gets hurt or Clint plays well or whatever, and they just don't do it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think too, like in terms of, I've always also made the argument in terms of, I feel like for me with Quin, I feel like he wants like the traditional, I guess you could say NBA offense. Everybody can shoot 1 through 5, switch 1 through 5, everything. And Okongwu he's worked on the 3-point shot. He's still working on it. He can, I would say I always said Clint is the better rim protector, but Okongwu is a better defender, if that makes sense, because he can kind of guard quicker, more agile players than Clint can, just because I would think because he's smaller, he's more nimble. So, I think they both bring something different to the table. So I would love to see him just, also as a pick and roll partner with Trae and allowing that to flourish as well. But that takes me into my next question now, and that's on Quin. Quin Snyder is a guy who, we Hawks did something unusual, brought him in technically after the All-Star break. Hey, coach the team. All right, cool. Offseason happens, brings his coaching staff, brings in his system. Obviously, you could see them working on things, and this was a work in progress of what they're trying to do. But like I said earlier, people are not sold on him. Some people are not sold on him. Like, oh, how do we know he's really that good of a coach? Look at his playoff record. Well, he lost to the peak Warriors and peak Rockets. I mean, I don't really know what you want to do there, but overall, what has been your impression of Quin Snyder as a coach? I think he's a good coach. I know there obviously have been some things, rotational wise, you can say there's some questions, not pulling guys soon enough. Maybe was that a lack of trust in the other guys? Maybe, and people were in the minutes too, I think some people were concerned about. But what is your impression of his first full season as the Atlanta Hawks head coach?
I think that number one, especially with coach evaluations, if you don't win, people blame the coach. Not everybody. But you know what I mean? Like it almost doesn't matter. And this is across sports. If you're a fan and your team's not winning, you get mad at a player or two that you may not like, and the coach. That's just what happens. So that's just some of it I have to just roll my eyes about. Like I saw multiple like fire Quin Snyder things last night, and it's like, guys, that's not a thing. I think it's fair though to say that he didn't do like an incredible job this year. That's reasonable to say. Like I think that them underachieving, he's going to get some of that. I think he would take that if you asked him with true serum. He's not going to be thrilled with the way anything went, and you take responsibility for that as the head coach, especially a highly paid one who they brought in, etc. First full season. We talked about it a little bit earlier, but this roster is not really what I think he wants in general right now. One of the few things that he was actually candid about throughout the season was that he kept coming back to how small they are. And not necessarily, and when I say that, people think center, and that's not what I mean. Like I'm not talking about Onyeka being small at center, just positional size wise. The combination of you already have the two small guards, and then their forward spots. Anytime you were missing Jalen, essentially, or especially Jalen and another guy, like at the end with Jalen, no Sadiq, they were just so incredibly small. And he would consistently mention like how hard it is to guard and rebound and sort of line up physically with these NBA teams when you're playing that small. So I'm not trying to excuse it. I do think that it's worth keeping in mind that this is not the roster that I think that is built for him, because as we talked about earlier, they just ran it back. They didn't change the roster. And that was a surprise to me because in part, you would want to equip your coach that you just paid a bunch of money to with the roster that he kind of is more suited to. So I think he's a good coach. I think he's really respected around the league. There's always a little bit of nuance, like in coach evaluation, because there aren't you can see your team profile stats, but like you're it's hard to evaluate. Even if someone watches every single minute of every single game and all that stuff, like how much of it is coaching, how much of it's players in the NBA. It's a players league on some level. You're looking on the margins. I think that Quin is a good coach. I don't think he's Eric Spoelstra. I don't think he's the best coach in the league. I think he's I would say he's an above average NBA head coach who I didn't love it all this year. Like you said, there's stuff you can always sort of nitpick, but I think that he is not the problem. I think by far and away, the roster was the problem compared to the coach this year. And the way the players performed, but mostly the roster construction would be what I would say is way above the list of like concerns. I think that if this happens again, if they underachieve expectations next year, the heat will turn up on Quin as the way that it does with any head coach that underperforms. Doesn't matter what happens there. But I don't think he's a problem. I think he's a pretty good to better than that head coach, top 10, 12 in the league, something like that. I think he's good. But there's only a handful of guys that I would say are always like difference makers.
Mm-hmm.
I always use Spo as my example because I believe that he is one always. Like that roster has no business being as good as it is ever, and Spo is just great. He's not. I don't think he's that good, but I think he's an upgrade on Nate. I thought Nate. By the end, Nate was getting too much heat probably, but I never loved the Nate experience. Like it is what it is. But I think Quin is a good head coach that I think he would probably admit was not his most favorite year because they just underachieved. And that's the nature of the beast.
Yeah, and then that's the business, and obviously, like I said, people are gonna have their questions. I mean, I remember people were saying, "Yeah, Quin, you might to get fired." And it was like halfway through the season. I'm like, they're not hiring him to fire him that quickly. Plus, I always used to say, like, if they do that, now it's sending a message as if I get fired, am I gonna get fired after a year? And you don't want that. You don't want that perception. So, and I think he, like I said, he did what he could, what he had. And he just said the right things. Oh, I love the guys. I love the guys I'm coaching. Almost like, yeah, I love my roster. But it's like he's supposed to say it. He can't say he hates his roster.
And he's not the GM. The people. It's always something fans forget this. Even media forgets this sometimes. Like he is not the GM. At one point, I covered a Hawks team that had Budenholzer actually being the coach and the person making the decisions. Quin's got a voice in the room. I'm not saying otherwise. He obviously has influence, but people equate that like, no, Quin's not making personnel decisions. Like he's in the mix. But in the end, he's it's the old Parcells line, like the pick their groceries. He's not doing that. Like he's just coaching the guys that are there. And I think that going back to what we said before about Landry and everything, it would sometimes help with even people like me and you and fans if Quin was a little bit more candid about what he wants to see. But NBA head coaches are paranoid. They don't want anybody to know anything, and he's one of those guys. Like he would just rather keep us in the dark to make sure that the opponent's in the dark. And I don't love that, but it just kind of is what it is.
Yeah, for sure. So we got to get back to a player talk. Next guy who is on this list of potential movement, DeAndre Hunter. I feel like DeAndre Hunter has made strides this year. I feel like he has had more consistency, I would say, this year. I think Quin has used him better. Obviously, him making that jump in a three-point shot has really helped him, just make him more of a person that you can keep on the floor, but just also his shot selection, shot profile has improved. And I think that has led to more consistent basketball from him. Obviously, he had his worst game, maybe of the entire season in Chicago. And I know people are just like, get him off the team. We're done with the DeAndre Hunter experience, everything like that. I'm a person who feels like Jalen Johnson helped him, because now he's not expected to be that wing, that guy at that spot. He can kind of just be what he is, and then Jalen can be that person. Because sometimes a pecking order can help a player when you're not expected to be this. Like, Tobias is probably better. Harris is better as a fourth or fifth option. You make him your second, yeah, of course you're going to think he's terrible, But can you just give me your thoughts on DeAndre Hunter? Do you think that he is going to be moved? I've said also with the lack of depth, I mean, if you trade him, you better have a plan to replace him. It's not like you have someone just ready to go like you did with JC. Yeah. So is Hunter at all in danger? Is it one of those they'll listen to conversations, they'll talk, but it's not something they're pushing for, and et cetera?
That last thing you said is really important. I'm glad you said it. Is that if you want to run Hunter out of town, and I understand on the wrong night, it is what it is, but he's still as much as he's not the guy that everyone, well, not everyone, a lot of people thought he might turn into, he's still a valuable player. That archetype of player who is 6'8", who can defend his position, who can shoot. is a valuable player, and they don't have a ton behind him at that spot. So that's worth keeping in mind. Also, what you said about him playing well this year is true. Like, I think he objectively had his best NBA season this year. He was efficient. He took more threes. He got to the line more. Yeah, like, he's not. I just wish people could forget where he was drafted at this point. Because, look, he's going into year 6 next year. It no longer matters where he was drafted. That doesn't matter. It doesn't matter anymore. Yeah, I hated the trade when it happened. I was right about that. I think they gave up too much for that, all that stuff. That's a long time ago now. The only problem, I should say, is that, like, that contract is not awful, but it isn't a huge plus. And that's one of the reasons he's still here now, honestly. He's been very available for about 2 years in a trade, realistically. I'm sure you remember all the reporting of, like, essentially everyone but Trae and Jalen are available is what happened at the deadline. He was one of those guys. And they've had talks about him different places, but the knees are a question. He's always got something going on with his lower body. He played 57 games this year. He's never had a season where he's played a full season. He's always had something go on with his knees. And defensively, like, he's just okay. He's just okay to pretty good. He's not a shutdown guy. So is he in danger? I think that they could certainly move him. They would be open to that, I think, at this point, based on what I've heard the last 6 months to a year. It's just that you've got to be cognizant of what you don't have on your roster. So if you trade, and that's always the thing. It's like, okay, if you trade DeAndre Hunter, given that the Hawks want to win, you need to get a replacement for him back. And, like, that doesn't happen. Like, you don't generally make deals that are like position for position trades where you get a guy back that is comparable to the guy you're losing. So yeah, it helps to have Jalen. And I think Sadiq helped too. He had a rough year with his shot, but, like, having another guy there was helpful. But DeAndre Hunter is still, and Quin will always say, he's still the guy that they use the most as the primary defender on top wings. He used to guard small guards. That doesn't really happen anymore. But if you get a Luka, you get a DeRozan, you get a Kawhi, Hunter's the guy on those guys every night. Quin will put him on those guys. And that's not easy to replace. So it is frustrating because you want him to be better than he is. But I would encourage people, like, he's not a young player anymore. He's going into year 6. He was already an old prospect. He is what he is. And that's okay. You said it earlier, like, his improvement on the margins this year was really encouraging. He did the stuff that's under his control. He took better shots. He played with more physicality. He attacked the rim. Those are really important things. And I think that he played at a starting small forward level this year. That may not sound sexy, but before that, you could argue he didn't play at that level. Like, he was always kind of like, obviously that was his role. He's been a starter for 5 years now, basically 4 years now. But it was more like, hey, we drafted you at number 4. You're going to start for us until you don't start for us. This year, I think he actually played at a starter level. It's just that he has that shine of the former top 5 pick, and he's not going to be that guy. I think he's just he's a quality player. He's a quality player, but he's also someone that you probably want to upgrade on if you possibly can. And I think that it's not really his fault, but especially when you have two small guards, it even puts more pressure on that starting small forward. And he's played well, but I think that, yeah, I almost feel bad because I felt bad criticizing him for the game 83 on Wednesday. He was just off. He was awful. And I don't say that with any glee. I felt bad because, like, he had played better this year, but that's the game everybody watches. It's on ESPN. It's a playoff game, and he was just atrocious. And I feel like that's going to stick to him, and that's unfortunate, but that's just the way things go.
Yeah, definitely. I was the same way. I was just like, I hate it for him because I know that's how people are going to view that. You know, I feel like when you have an opinion on players, some people are just going to believe it. They're going to stick with that opinion, even if they're playing well. And as soon as they play bad, they're like, oh, all right, see, I knew I was right.
Well, it's also the other way too. Like, I'm sure you remember this. Like, he had a big game against Miami a couple years ago in the playoffs where, like, he actually had a pretty bad season that year. And he had one huge, like, half in a playoff game. And then nationally, it's like, oh, DeAndre Hunter is this two-way monster for the Hawks. And it's like, actually, he's not. Like, so it actually goes both ways. Cam Reddish did the same thing. I'm sure you remember this. Cam Reddish had that one big half. And it's like, oh, Cam Reddish is a problem. It's like, no, he actually is not very good. He's just not. But those little moments on national TV in particular stand out, and this time it went the other way for him.
Yeah, for sure. And then that's, like I said, it sucks, but that's where they are right now. And obviously, like, we mentioned already in the pod, this is a big offseason coming up for them. You would assume that this is the time for them to make moves and do things. From observing the team going into this offseason now, obviously by the time at the time of this recording, we don't know what they've said in their pressers yet and all that stuff.
That's tomorrow as we're recording this podcast.
Yeah. So we don't have that, but and obviously, I still think they're going to continue the development plan. Like I said, multiple guys improved. Hunter improved. Jalen improved. I think Bay improved, especially using his ability to cut to the rim, finish at the basket. I think you saw improvement from Kobe. Like I said, you saw multiple guys improve, and I mean that's why Trent Forrest is here. They feel like he improved from a year ago to this year. So, but for you, if let's just say you're a GM, Brad. What I guess are your highest priorities for this team this offseason? I'm not going to ask you like what player would you acquire and all that because obviously that's the whole thing. But just what do you would say are like these are the top things that we need to either change, adjust, or do to get this team back on the right track?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to answer just because like there's sort of things that are in place. But this is very obvious, but it's also true. You cannot be what they want to be as an NBA team, and I'm not even saying win a championship. I'm saying be a top 4 or 5 seed in the East. You can't be a top 4 or 5 seed in the East and be a bottom 5 defense. Like they just have to have better personnel defensively. And nationally, that means, Trae Young is so bad. He just kills their defense. It's like, no, Trae's not a great defender, but it's not. There's this caricature where people think that he's the only reason why they're bad defensively, which is it's comically wrong. The Hawks don't have great personnel defensively. Dejounte is not the guy he was billed to be at this point. When he was a young guy at San Antonio and that was his role, he really was an awesome defender. Now by the way, this is the case for the vast majority of players. When they have a high leverage role on offense, they get worse on defense. That's just the way life works. Mikal Bridges, and by the way, is doing this in Brooklyn. He's still a pretty good defender, but he's not the guy he used to be in Phoenix defensively. He's just not. That's what happens. But when you're that small, Trae and Dejounte in the backcourt, you're automatically bad on the perimeter. Those two guys play together, you're bad on the perimeter. And then you have other issues too, like Saddiq Bey, not a great defender. You're playing Bogey, who's not a great defender at this point, Garrison Matthews, etc. So like the low-hanging fruit is just improve your defensive personnel. And maybe that's somewhat internal. If Kobe plays more and plays like the guy he did this year, that's going to help you. Is that going to fix your defense by itself? No, but that's going to help you. But I think just generally speaking, investing more on that end of the floor is what they're going to have to do. Jalen will improve defensively. I do think that. Like he's got the flashes already, but play in, play out. He's still a young guy. He makes mistakes. That happens. It's okay. It's not a problem. But I always lean that way anyway. I just value defense a lot, which makes this team hard sometimes to watch for me. It's like almost physically painful to watch them defend sometimes. But that's what I would say. I mean, big picture, of course, it's like decision making on Trae and Dejounte is priority number one because that's like going to influence everything that they do. But no matter what they do there, they just have to get better defensively, and that starts with personnel. And there are coaching components, there are effort components, execution components. It's not like anything is removed from it. And I'm sure Quin would admit that. Quin, again, true serum, I think he would probably note that, hey, we don't have great players defensively. But they still should have been better than they were this year. Both can be true. Like, that's what I would say. They should have been 22nd in defense this year versus 27th. And that is a pretty big, meaningful difference. But no matter what, even if they're an offensive team, and as long as they have Trae, they're probably going to be an offensive first team. You still got to get to like 16th defensively. Like you can't be awful. You just can't be. And that's where they've been too often for too long.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it was worse when Trae was out. And they were like, well, the defense is better. Well, everybody's playing more natural positions. DeJounte's going back to point, which I feel like is just a better defensive position for him. And then you're
playing bigger. And by the way, it's March, and the entire league scoring went off a cliff for about 4 weeks in March, which no one wanted to mention that because it was too convenient of a narrative to say that the Hawks were better defensively. And look, they were better defensively. That's the thing. It actually is true. If all you did was take Trae off the team and move DeJounte to point guard and kind of acted normally everywhere else on the roster, you would get better defensively. But guess what? You would get a lot worse offensively. A lot worse. So it's like, which one do you want? Would you rather be the 17th best defense, but also suddenly be below average offensively? Because that's what they would be. So I'm not saying it's a perfect solution, and Trae does have weaknesses. I'm not saying he doesn't, but like you can't ignore that. So it's same thing with the offense. And I'll be the first to say that, like, just because you have Trae offensively and you're good, you have to consider his defense. That it does matter, but I think especially at that position, offense is more important than defensive point guard. It's like so. Yeah, it's in the end, you need context, and people don't like context.
Yeah. It's context is not a thing they like to.
It's not convenient. No,
people have the narratives. Like I've said, people have the narratives.
But last thing, being small hurts your defense. If all you track was size, it's not universally true. Like I'm not saying the other guy, Onyeka's a good defender, despite being 6'8" at center. He's a good defender. But like generally speaking, if all you know is the size of one team and the size of the other, the bigger team is probably better defensively. Probably. Not always, but probably. And that kind of tracks with the Hawks as small as they were, which was epitomized by the last game.
Yeah.
When they had you got to start Trae, Dejounte, and Bogey. You're just not going to stop anybody. You're just not. It's not going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. And and I haven't mentioned this, but I also said too, because I'm about to ask you about Trae. It was weird because with the Vic Krejci thing, everybody was obviously upset because it's like this man's been your starter replacement when Jalen was out, and now we get into a playing game where you would think, okay, you would assume, okay, we're trying to win this game, but then you don't convert him to an NBA standard deal. Then you also bring back Trae from his injury. And it's like, so what is, and that goes back to what I was saying about the conflicting message with the front office. Like, are we trying to do something or not? Because if we're trying to win, then we would convert Krejci. If you're not, then why are we bringing Trae back? So my question to you about Trae is just through this entire season, obviously he's been at the forefront of trade rumors. He has scaled on record after the All-Star game. He basically was like, to me, it sounded like he was like, I'm not going to force my way out, but if they want me to go, then okay. Like he's not going to be like, get me out of here. But obviously his agency is also Clutch Sports. They're going to push. I'm sure they brought it up to him. People will be like, oh, they've talked about it. He's in LA. Can you talk about his season this year? It feels like some people have said that this actually has maybe been his best year as an overall, increasing the steals. I think I forgot how many games straight he had a steal in. He put in more effort defensively when he got his offensive shot going after that struggle at the beginning of the year. He was going, his 3-point shot was going. He was shooting during that stretch close to 40%. And he shoots long threes. He's not shooting up on the line. So can you just talk about his season from just what you've seen, especially from maybe let's just say that 2021 run where he was then to where he is now in his career, and just him as a player and his growth, especially because I think part of the reason why they hired Quin was to pair him with Trae to get the most out of him. And you could say there have been some things that he's improved under him.
Right. I think that it's interesting because of, I think if you just polled random Hawks fans and asked them about Trae this year, they would probably point to the team record and, the All-Star thing, he had to be an injury replacement. It might sound crazy to say he might have had his best season, but I don't think he definitively had his best season, but there is if you asked me to frame an argument that said he did, I could do it. Mm-hmm. I think it was his best defensive season ever. That is, I'm confident in that. By the way, the numbers back that up. His individual numbers back that up. His steal rate backs it up. The eye test backs it up. And look, I said it before. He's not a good defender still, but he is no longer the caricature of the people that had of him when he was a rookie. He actually might have been as bad as people said he was. He was really bad when he was really young, and he's still a minus. He's still small, but he's gotten a lot better on the end of the floor. And when you combine that with he still led the league in assist percentage this year. I think he was number 2 in the league in assists per game to Halliburton. He had a higher true shooting than the year before. He took more threes than the year before and made more threes than the year before on percentage. He had a very good season that I think people would not describe as that unless you really, really watched it every day, because the Hawks didn't win. And there is a rarefied air when you're the best player on the team, you're going to get blamed when your team doesn't play well, whether you should or not. And there's a little bit of that. It's fair to be like, hey, and by the way, he also this is the first time he's ever really had a serious injury in his life. Mm. He never had a surgery in his life until this surgery he just had. And he didn't quite go as far as, I don't think he should have came back at the end of the year. With the way that he had to operate with the brace, he gave a quote last night after the game about how his doctor was going to be mad at him. They took the brace off. Mm. I don't think he should have come back. But he did. And that's actually kind of on brand for Trae. Trae likes to play. He hated not playing. Hated it. I mean, he said that on the record. You could see that. Like, all that said, like, I think he had a pretty good year for him, but I think he would tell you like they didn't win, and that's unfortunate. I mean, and both credit wise, blame wise, I think that you got to own that as the best player. Part of that's because he was hurt, but they weren't great when he played either. So it's a weird spot for him to be in. As far as like him leaving town, I'll say this, and it's April 18th as I'm recording this podcast. I've never heard once from someone I trust anywhere that Trae wants out of Atlanta. Could I see him doing that in the future? Sure. I've always said, hey, there's a world in year 8 or whatever that he looks up and they haven't won and he's like, get me out of here. Would that shock me? No, absolutely not. It would not. But I maintain, and I'm fairly plugged in. I've never heard anyone say he wants out of Atlanta. This is the first time, as I said before, that I actually think the Hawks might just trade him, and that it's not likely in my mind. But 2 years ago, that would have been unthinkable for the Hawks to trade him without him asking to be traded. That's been my whole mantra has been like, the only way Trae leaves is if he has to be traded. And that maybe is changing a little bit now. I just by the buzz. I'm not saying it is, but it could be, I suppose. But yeah, the clutch thing is like the big bad boogeyman kind of thing. It gets a little bit overplayed. But Rich Paul is his, he's the guy that runs clutch. He's not necessarily Trae's number one and only agent, but like he's the big boss. If they want a guy out of a situation, they're pretty good at getting the guy out of a situation. But they have to want that. And that includes the player wanting that. And again, I've never heard that actually him wanting to be out of there. So it's a long and winding answer, but this is one of those situations where like, until you know, you don't know. And I'll be the first to say, I don't know what Trae's thinking right now. I don't. I would be lying to you if I told you that I did. I know that Trae likes to win and he's a really competitive guy, and having a season where you finish 10th and lose by 15, 20 points in the play-in isn't going to sit well with him. He's probably not thrilled, but does he blame the team? Does he blame just the situation? Is he mad at the city? Is he mad at wrestler? I have no idea. I actually don't know. So it's not a great satisfying answer. I wish I knew more than I did right now, but until I hear that he wants out, my opinion is going to be he doesn't want out. So people can talk if they want to. And if I was the Hawks, just to put myself in the GM shoes that you talked about earlier, the ownership shoes, I'm not trading that guy unless he asks me, unless he wants out still. I would not trade Trae Young this summer. And unless he made it perfectly clear that he was going to make my life miserable if I didn't trade him. You know what I mean? That's just me. But look, there's nuance here, and it's also fair to say they've gone through 3 years in a row, pretty disappointing results. And Trae is even at the very best, Trae is a challenging player to build around. No, I didn't say impossible. Challenging in the modern NBA to have your best player be a 6'1" guard. If all you know about that is your best player 6'1" guard, when's the last time a team won a championship with a 6'1" guard as their best player? The answer is 1990.
Different time.
It's hard. It doesn't mean it's impossible. It's not impossible. It's hard. And I think the Hawks probably knew that. At least they should have known that. I'm not going to say anything about the trade in 2018. Like, it all happened. But it's funny. I don't know about you. Like, I feel like Trae's underrated now, which it blows me away. It blows me away because, like, yeah, just to put it all the cards on the table, I was covering the team then. I blasted the Hawks for the trade. I thought it was a bad move. I wanted them to draft Luka. I think that they should draft Luka, just candidly. I think if you poll the league right now, there is probably no one that would say that the Hawks did the right thing 6 years later. But now it's become like Trae's bad in some circles. And it's like, guys, he's really, really good still. But, we could do an hour on that. We won't do it. But I think that it's a big summer. I'd love to learn. I'd love to know what's going on in Trae's head. I'd love to know what's going on in his camp, any of that stuff. And maybe we'll find out, but we don't know yet.
Yeah, for sure. And like I said, you're right. People are pushing the narrative that he's not good. I mean, listen, I made a tweet a year ago about just the thing is, I've never said Trae was better than Luka. I've just said that I feel like at times people make it seem like Luka is this Hall of Fame untouchable guy and Trae is just this regular player who plays. And I'm just like, the gap's not that big, guys. like to that extent. And I'm obviously Dallas Mavericks fans found it, and that turned into something. But
there was. I'm not kidding you. There was I would say 2-year period where I basically just decided I was not going to say or type the words Luka Doncic of any kind, because if you did that, and not even. I've always been. I like Luka, but as someone who covers the Hawks, there was a time where anything involving the Hawks or Mavericks became just this proxy war.
Yeah.
And it was hilarious because like I was like, I cover the whole league too. I work for Dime, I do national stuff, and I was like, I basically just can't say Luka's name. Even if it doesn't even matter, even if it's not about Trae at all. It's like it got so crazy there for like 2-3 years. It's less so now, but even then, I'm sure you've seen it in the last 24 hours. It's like people bringing it up again. It's like,
oh
man,
yeah,
we're
found
done with this.
Tweeted me and said, "Oh yeah, Trae's better." I'm like, "Well, the tweet never said he was better, but okay." But like I said, context. Yeah. I was gonna let you go, but I gotta ask this one last quick thing. This could be a quick answer for you. For Dejounte. First, I don't know if people said you read between the lines. Have you heard anything that Dejounte formally requested out at all this season from Atlanta? Like, was that ever like, or he heavily hinted at that? Because obviously last night, I don't know if you watched, I'm assuming you watched his presser potentially. He was very candid that he did not like the game plan, I think. And so obviously probably frustrated about how the game went. And we don't know if that's just, people are going to say, like, what's his relationship with Quin? What's that like? Because we know about some of the stuff and just.
I think he and Quin get along, by the way.
Yeah, I think they
get along fine.
I think I think with what happened earlier, the tweets and just, oh, we're not getting used correctly, and just all that. Like what has been Dejounte's feeling about this team? Has he wanted out? Is that something he's maybe going to push for again? Is it all just smoke and he's just playing and people just assume he wants out?
So it got a lot quieter. I think I don't know why. It could have been that they had to come to Jesus at some point post deadline. They just said, "Hey, we're all here. Let's chill," kind of thing. Dejounte going on Trae's podcast, that kind of stuff. Like they've been a lot more publicly chummy in the last 2 months. The way that I said it on my show and what I would still say now in February was that I don't think it ever got to Dejounte demanding a trade. The way that I was putting it then was that it was not one-sided. It was not the Hawks trying to trade this player that did not want to be traded. It wasn't like Dejounte is in there, begging them not to trade him. Because there was the whole thing about he had just signed the extension, and I get it. If without any context, a guy signs an extension with you, and you look to trade him 6 months later, that can look really cold and calculating on the Hawks side. And there are bad, like the example that I used then that this was Blake Griffin. So Blake Griffin signs in LA. They do the whole dog and pony show with him, and they trade him 6 months later, and he didn't want to be traded. And that was pretty brutal from the Clippers, honestly, to send him to Detroit, and that whole thing happened. So that was not this. Again, I don't think Dejounte asked for a trade, but they were participating. He's also a Clutch client. I think they were participating in the process when the Hawks were looking at trading Dejounte. They were not pushing him out, but like the notion that like Dejounte was standing at the door like, please don't trade me, guys. I only want to be here. Nowhere was not the case. Does that make sense? What I'm saying? Yeah. I think he was agreeable to being somewhere else. I think deep down, this is me saying, I think, not I know. I think that he knows, or he would prefer being the guy, or at least being the point guard who has the ball in his hands. I think you saw that when Trae was out, both on the floor, the way he carried himself when Trae was out, all that stuff. I think he's just more confident in that role and more comfortable in that role. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with that. That's just the way the nature of the beast is. And I know he and Trae said all the right things when the trade happened. They, I think, mutually pushed for it together. But that doesn't mean that 2 years later that they're both in that same spot. They don't hate each other. There's also the notion that they hate each other now or whatever. No, I don't think that's the case either. I think that on Dejounte's side, he would have been amenable to a trade. Is he going to be? He might feel differently now. It's been 2 months. They couldn't trade him. We'll see this summer. But if you asked me, 8-10 weeks ago, if Dejounte was at least very willing to be gone, I would have said yes. And maybe that's changed now, but we'll see.
Yeah, for sure. And like I said, that was a weird, just leading up to the trade deadline was weird of everything that was happening. And
it was so strange. I mean, it was so public for so long. I mean, that's the thing. Like you rarely ever see a guy, and Dejounte's, the word star is interesting for him. He made an all-star team. I don't know if he's a star, but like he's on that next level, if nothing else. Like he's a top 50 player. Like he's a really good player. You don't see that kind of guy just dangling in trade rumors for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and have that guy not be traded. Like it's very odd. Only that, like guys like John Collins, who I adore. I like John. That's the kind of guy that sits on trade that sits on the block for that long. Like he's not a star, good player. Miles Turner did the same thing for a long time. Guys at Dejounte's level don't usually have that whole dog and pony show where like everybody in the whole world knows he's so super available, and then it doesn't happen. Like that was just a very odd 2-month period. But
yeah, for sure. It was, I didn't, like I said, all the social stuff wasn't helping either, because everybody's just like, what's going on? Like, is he unhappy? Is just him expressing himself? And
the leak DM was
that was I know, it's just like, oh boy, it's like, how's the chemistry and everything? And and I think this is where you get those things. You've heard this I've talked about this over the last few years too. I was like, people have asked like, does this team like each other? And so when you see stuff like that, you start wondering like, oh dang, do they? But I think you can like each other, but also not work compatibly on the court. And I think some people sometimes get that mixed up. So it definitely happens, man. But we've been going for about an hour, man. So I'm not going to keep you that much longer, man. I know
that's all my fault, by the way. I'm long-winded. Listen, you appreciate this as someone who does a lot of solo podcast. I just get to talking, and
Yeah. Listen, sometimes it can be tough if there's not a lot happening.
It can. That's absolutely true.
It's just like really not a lot. It's like I was like, they'll play like Portland. I'm like, I mean, there's not really much to say. Like, I mean, they beat Portland tonight, good performance. I mean, like, I don't know what you want me to say.
That's one of the reasons I have people make fun of me, because I kind of have somewhat of a formula for post-game shows. And I say, try to do a post-game show without a formula if you're talking by yourself. Like, you kind of have to have some stuff that you always do, like some ways you frame the games, because otherwise you turn the mic on in February and it's like, they lost again. I don't know what else do you want me to say, and you got to talk 30 minutes. So it's actually hard. So shouts to you. I know it's hard.
But like I said, man, I appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to come on here, man. Obviously, as this offseason involves, we have bring you back on, talk about any other changes that could potentially come as well. But let people know where they can find you, your podcast, everybody you work for, your Twitter, everything.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me. I host a Locked on Hawks podcast, which is certainly the closest thing to this. So if you like this, you certainly should like this. And also follow that show. It's available anywhere you get your podcasts, plus YouTube, etc. I used to run Peachtree Hoops. I don't anymore. That's a good place to read about content. I'm still in the Slack channel with those guys. I write about the NBA, college basketball, and the draft at Dime on Uprocks. Not just Hawks, but beyond those things. I have a Braves podcast that got shuttered and will be back at some point in the near future. It was interesting. I'm trying to get that fired up again. So the main thing is, I guess, Twitter. So at BT Rowland on Twitter, and also Locked on Hawks. So a good crossover with this. And I always say that there's a bunch of really good Hawks podcasts, and there's room for all of them. We should all help each other, because I feel like if you're a diehard, you're probably listening to all of them anyway. But if you're not, go ahead and flip the switch, subscribe, all that fun stuff. And you should be doing the same thing here.
Yeah, and definitely, man. Definitely tune into this guy. He's great. And it's funny that you say that. I said, I feel like, I don't know if since you're at some of these you're at the media things, it feels like Atlanta has like the most just like independent media people there. Like, I feel like every other place has like, they have the big company, the big stations, or all their local stations are there. Here, it's like, it feels like, oh, you got, a lot of independents. A lot of maybe 92.9 games there. A lot of people who created their own stuff. Because obviously, I've thought about, if I get more time, like trying to get a press pass and trying to get out to the games if I can. Because it seems like that's who's there. That's who's coming out to these games and doing it, which shows you we're more dependable than the, I guess, I don't want to make an argument like local media.
No, part of it is that for a long time, and that's how I got my foot in the door too. The Hawks have always been really good at not shutting out. A lot of teams won't credential as freely as the Hawks do, or at least they did when I was. I don't know how it is now, but they were pretty open to blogs, and Peachtree Hoops was how I got my foot in the door. I used to run that site, and I mean, part of that there's only one full-time beat writer, and Lauren does a great job with the AJC. She's the only person that is a full-time person covering the Hawks. That's her only job. Jamil does a great job independently. Kevin Chenard does Hawks.com, but that's Hawks.com, and that's only that's not his full-time job either. Kevin's a teacher. I have several jobs. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there are openings for it because the Athletic didn't fulfill their job, and like there's stuff that's available, but you have to have it takes some dedication. I'm not saying about me, whatever, but to show up all the time when it's not your full-time job it's a hard thing, and it's always been like that in Atlanta. It's actually, I think it's pretty cool actually, and hopefully it continues. But I mean, that's the thing. Look, at the same time, I would love for some people to pay more folks, not even necessarily me, but to do this full time. Like, it'd be great. Like, you go to Philly or New York and they have 5 beat writers, and Atlanta has 1. And it'd be great if someone wanted to pay me or somebody else to do this full time. But
for sure.
In the meantime, here we are.
Yeah, this is where we are, man. So, like I said, maybe I can find some time and try to make a couple of things, and shot us. So obviously, we can eventually meet in person.
Yeah, come on down. West Georgia's finest.
You gotta show me the ropes. How do y'all do it around here? I'm not used to being on this level.
It's honestly pretty straight ahead. But yeah, I'm sure we'll do that. Come on down. I'm sure they would openly credential you. You have lots of podcast content. You can just be like, hey, this is my resume. Here you go. Listen to my podcast, and they'll find out quickly that you actually are not irresponsible. So there you go,
sir. Appreciate you. But like I said, guys, big offseason coming up for the Atlanta Hawks. We're going to have to see what happens. I appreciate Brad coming on to the Bleav in Hawks podcast. Obviously, you guys know where to find me. You've seen at the bottom screen, or if listeners to audio, Bricey_2K, BRICY _2K. And then also, if you listen to any podcast available, any podcast platforms, Spotify, Apple, main ones like that. Subscribe, like the video for if you're watching this on YouTube, and appreciate you guys. And like I said, appreciate you, Brad. This is your Bleav in Hawks podcast. See you next time.